So good afternoon. I hope that this has been a great day for you all. Um, I, I, I admire your dedication to hanging out on Zoom and making it all work. I'm David Greenham. I'm the Associate Director at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. And today we're going to talk about a little bit about what the conversation was earlier that I just listened to a little bit, and talk about what do we do when we have to have these difficult conversations. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can get all this stuff so I can see you all here. There we go. Okay, we'll go back here. There we go. So go ahead and feel free. I'm assuming that you all have been here a little bit, but if you want to go ahead in the chat and introduce yourself, that's perfectly fine. We are going to use the chat today for a few things. Normally with this program, I might do group sessions, but because of the time it takes to go from the big group to the breakouts and then come back again, I think we're going to go ahead and just try to do it as a group. And Robin or Yvonne, I'm not sure if they can just unmute themselves and ask questions, but if they can, you can also do that. So we'll look at, I've got the chat up and we can also take questions along the way. So again, thank you for being here. So as you know, of course, we're all struggling with the challenge of this pandemic, and whether or not you agree with the approach that's being used to bring students and teachers back together in your school or your district, it's in the back of my mind, in the back of everybody's mind, that we know that whatever we're doing right now is likely to change in the coming months. For many of you, I suspect there's already been this sort of mind-numbing changes that go on. And by most accounts, we're only halfway through this thing. In addition to my work at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine, I'm also an adjunct at the University of Maine at Augusta, and we're doing in-person social distancing classrooms. And we're also doing random testing here on campus as well. I was just tested last week, and although my test was negative, I'm told there were at least 2 positive tests, or there have been so far. Nobody really knows quite what that means. And so we just sort of go along. So in this time of COVID, and then we have this sort of remarkable political strife right now and uncertainty from all kinds of directions. So our best approach, of course, is it's super simple. Just be ready for anything. And that, of course, is impossible. So, but we're all doing the best we can. And I just want to say that for you all, especially teachers who are in the classroom, and I know many of you are a little more isolated, even within your school or within your place, you're doing yeoman's work, and thank you for what you're trying to do. So we know that anything can come up, and we know that things are happening, and so today we're going to practice a little bit. Now this shift toward a more divisive country, of course, is not new at all, but it's all been compounded by upsetting the norm that we all knew or thought we knew thanks to COVID. And the kind of sense that we have the sense certainly that many things are happening now. So one of the early books that I turned to as we at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center started responding to some requests to help with anti-bias and other concerns in the classroom was this book, The Political Classroom by Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy. The book is based on their research between 2005 and 2009 of 20 different high schools in 3 Midwestern states and focuses on discussions of political issues within high school classrooms. The book includes case studies and also suggests different methods of engagement to ensure a focus on providing students with the tools they need to listen and to process information so that they can make up their own minds. And that's ultimately, we sometimes lose track of that critical piece. And we're told oftentimes by somebody who disagrees with us that we're trying to indoctrinate students in our beliefs. But we often see that indoctrination that they're afraid of is counter to an indoctrination that that their family or whoever, their other influencers are trying to do as well. But our role as educators is actually not to indoctrinate them at all. It's to give them the tools to do their own thinking and do their own discovery. So they say, despite the challenges, we argue that teachers should not shy away from political controversy and instead see their job as helping students develop the skills and dispositions of deliberation so that young people are able to practice listening, reason giving, and considering how their views affect others. And we're not going to get too far into these issues today. It's certainly not going to be a political event here, but I share this resource because I want you to see just how important it is that we understand that our divisiveness is already affecting our students in a really profound way. Obviously, COVID-19 is a terrible thing. As of this morning, it has infected more than 36 million people worldwide. More than 1 million people have died. Our country, as you know, accounts for over 20% of the total number of those infected and close to 25% of the number of recorded fatalities from this virus. Just yesterday, it was announced that there are more active cases of COVID-19 in the White House than there are in New Zealand, Taiwan, and Vietnam combined. And those 3 countries have a combined population of 124 million people. It's a remarkable fact. To think that we're somehow going back to normal, quote, is ignoring our human history. In the 20th century alone, there were 3 such events: World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. I'm not even counting the flu. We know that each of these events changed the world for good. And of course, we could also add the Industrial Revolution and the one we know about firsthand, but we hardly really acknowledge, the computer age. Both of those have completely changed our society. Well, this is something that's going to change our society. And we know that there's another thing right on its heels, and that is climate change. So of course, all of these things affect our school climate and our community climate and our mental health and well-being. So, now where is this? There we go. I knew they were there. So here we see a remarkable little piece. And this is a slide that comes from, that actually came from Paula McAvoy, but is information compiled by the Pew Research Center. As I'm sure you know, Pew is one of the most well-respected surveyors of the mood of American citizens. And this slide alone shows this alarming graphic that is about divisiveness with regard to political party. In just a decade, those identifying as Democrats and Republicans have almost equally developed unfavorable attitudes about the other party. But here's another piece of it. In 2016, nearly 50% of those identifying as Democrats and Republicans said they see the other party as a threat to our country. Now, you don't really have to have watched a minute of the debates or the social media tirades that follow to come away with the sense that each party firmly believes and is regularly stating that the other party is the primary threat to our country. And of course, we're hearing this and seeing this in school, which brings us back to the political classroom and the essential question of their work, which is, how should we live together? It's a great question for all of us to consider. And that's where this program we're going to learn can come in handy. Now, several years ago, Teaching Tolerance, the educational arm of the Southern Poverty Law Center, created this handbook called Speak Up at School. And Robin, if you can share that link in the chat, that would be great. It's a free program. You can take it and use it, and I'll give you some resources for it. I have to say, I was introduced to this system about 3 years ago, and honestly, I use it just about every week in my own work and in my personal life. The two fundamentals of the work are that everyone needs to be a person who speaks up, and everyone needs to make sure that hate doesn't have the final word. So let's use a quick chat exercise. And I think that it'll help introduce us to this. So I'm gonna give you a statement with 2 blanks in it, and I'm looking for 2 words or phrases that complete this statement for you, and you can add them right in the chat. And the statement is, when I think about the kinds of political discussions that are occurring in the classroom this fall, I feel blank because I'm blank. Take a minute and think about your answer and share it. There's no right answer, of course. It's just, how do you feel? When I think about the kinds of political discussions that are occurring in the classroom this fall, I feel blank because I'm blank. Encouraged and hopeful. Thank you, Carly. Overwhelmed. Yeah. Absolutely. Conflicted? Absolutely. There's a lot of different forces that come into play. Nervous, concerned about what others are going to tell you, what's going to happen. And it's not just from administration, absolutely, it's from parents as well. Angry and scared. All legitimate issues, all legitimate concerns. And when I say all, I include the first one, the hopeful. Yeah. These are great comments. Seeing it as an opportunity is really important. I will say, you know, our center, I had so much stuff scheduled last spring that when we were shut down, and our center has been using this time and seeing it as an opportunity to move our programs online, to work on our archives and figure out how we can do more of getting first person accounts of challenging things into the hands of classroom teachers and students. So yeah, stressed is of absolutely. And right, and how do you know you're giving them what they need? These are great comments. Thank you very much. So the Speak Up at School program will help us think about what we can do when we hear the challenging issues starting. We think about our ready responses. When you hear something that offends me, or I don't find that funny, or I'm surprised to hear you say that, we also might think about what kind of questions we might ask. You know, it gives us a chance to consider ways we might continue the conversation. What do you mean by that? Why would you say something like that? What's the point that you're trying to make by saying that? Some of us hear someone say something that is improper and we immediately try squelching it or sort of making it go away, or tell that individual, no, you can't say that here. And then that becomes the end of it. But pointed questions help the speaker and listener to dig beneath the surface of what it is they're saying. And that's actually where the work needs to be done. And of course, one of the key issues and the challenges is, how do you say it? We have to remember that we are hoping to teach. So the way we say it, just like the way you talk about somebody needing to correct something in a paper or whatever they're trying to do, the way you say it really means everything. So you have to consider your tone of speaking. You have to assess the risk of speaking up and understand that change sometimes takes time. But if you always keep your goal in mind, that's where really we can make a difference. And it takes time. It's hard work. If it was easy, we'd have done it already. So what questions do you have so far? Does it all begin to make sense? It's not a very difficult system, you'll find, and that's one of the reasons is that it is they want you to be able to use it. They want your students to be able to use it. Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
This just links for me back to something that Kat said in her remarks about kind of letting go of that sort of marathon metaphor and going more with yoga and the idea of practice. And just, I'm not in daily contact with students anymore, but I know that there were certainly days where I was just like so good with my tone and, you know, kind of being able to assess and what's my goal, and I'm going to let that go because I'm going to talk to them later about this other thing that's more important or whatever. And then other days where I just had none of that available to me, and I would be very reactive and I might use a sharp tone and kind of blow it. And it varied day to day, but that idea of just coming back and trying again, and not seeing it as this thing that we ever are 100% there, but that it's a practice.
And you do that for those of us who have kids. You know that's how it goes. You know? My kid's 25 and lives in Halifax, and I'm still like, okay, well, that's how am I gonna? Robin, did you have a question or a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say that I really appreciate the ready responses, whether they're exactly those words or something a little bit different. And I remember a few years ago, the first time that I was kind of stuck with that, and because it was about students making jokes that are offensive. And so like planning ahead to know that I just need to say, like, that's not funny to me, like that planning ahead made it much easier to just speak up in the moment, because I didn't have to think about like, wait, what am I going to say if I say something? So I know we just went through that, but for me, like pausing and like even practicing that, or like taking that moment of reflection, was helpful to be ready for more situations to like respond in a timely way.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? You can't see everybody, so just speak up if you're.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just thinking back to this past week. I had a class of 6th graders, and, you know, there's so much conversation between students and sort of like lull moments where you're like, ooh, what's, is this not like some stuff where you're like, okay, is this kind of inappropriate? Or, oh, they're talking about something, they're curious about it, so I want to encourage that. But also where 2 students will be sort of kind of arguing against each other, or I feel like conversations can so easily get derailed. And in that moment, it's like, okay, we need to focus on the task at hand. So I kind of almost just have to shut down the conversation, which isn't necessarily what I really want to do, but I just feel overwhelmed, like how to, to keep this constructive or to keep this helpful versus, okay, now everyone's just gonna say a bunch of stuff that doesn't really have the time to get unpacked. You know what I mean? So like in those situations, what are everyone's thoughts and experiences? Like, I'm sure we can all relate to just instances where people are saying things where like we just don't have the time.
Well, and they address that in this, and that's a great point. And so that's a great way to move forward. So let's actually look at this process, and you'll see a little bit more about the options here. So in this program, they suggest that you might use one of 4 methods. The first one, of course, is to interrupt the thing that's being said. And then you might also try questioning. We saw a couple of those questions. Another one, as you're the teacher and you're the one who hears these things over and over and over again in time, do a little more research so that you can educate about what is the basis for this statement that they're making. We know we hear some of the similar things. And then we'll talk about echo, which is actually the easiest one, and the one I think that probably I use the most. So let's just dive in to them, and we'll start with the interrupt. So by interrupting, we mean just that, stop the train. And this is the one that is necessary every single time. And I know sometimes you're in the middle of a lesson or have somewhere to be, but it doesn't make any difference. This is where you can't let hate have the final word. And so you might end up just interrupting and saying, now I don't have time right now. We don't have time right now to have this conversation, but I'm going to write a note right here. And we're going to come back to this conversation because what you just said was really, really important. And it's challenging, and we need to delve into it. So you don't let them off the hook. But it does take the discipline of making sure you take that extra second to write it down, that I've got to go back to it. Because that's really the most critical thing. We can't allow hate to just sit. It has to be addressed every single time. Generally, it's just simply effective to say, that word is hurtful, please don't use it, or something like that. And stop it right there. And then you have other options for later on if you don't have the time. But it's a great point. If you do have the time, questioning is really wonderful because it makes the person who spoke think about what they meant. And you know that kids just parrot all the time. All people parrot all the time. And so they just say stuff, whatever it is they heard, they heard or somebody said or whatever that is. And so, but when they say it, they have to own it. I'm teaching a class right now on anti-bias with a senior college here in Augusta, and I'm doing it with senior college students who are all, in their 70s and 80s. And you can imagine there's things that people say. So what exactly do you mean by that word or that comment? And as soon as you are likely to say the wrong thing once, but you're not really going to say the wrong thing twice in a row unless you're using it as a tool. We've seen several times where something has happened with this current political administration where you thought, well, surely they're going to back away from this statement that they just made, and they kind of double down on it. It's a pretty bold strategy, and it seems to work because it throws the listener a little bit. It's not what they expect. In the long run, it doesn't work because it doesn't mean anything, but it is a strategy that sometimes people will use and sometimes your students may use it. But the more you can take the time and question, tell me more about what you mean. When you say, I just had somebody come over here from the Veterans Center because it was on here in campus because somebody there had said Hitler wasn't such a bad guy. And I don't know what they were talking about or what it was, but we had a conversation about how do you respond to that statement? Because he's not a Holocaust expert or a Nazi expert or whatever, but he knew that was a wrong statement. It was a very interesting conversation. So let's go on to the next, educate. And this is where we're in our wheelhouse. We're educators. So this should be where we can work it. It's just that we actually have to take the time to take a real look at this sort of, face first. What is that phrase? What does it mean? And so you have to sort of examine that. Certainly I work at the Holocaust Human Rights Center. We often run into anti-Semitism and the tropes of anti-Semitism. And so I had to learn what is the protocols of the elders of Zion? And what does it mean when somebody talks about, being a Shylock or whatever those things are? And so you have to do a little bit of the research. But once you've done it and you have it, I wouldn't research everything. I'd research the things that come and this is a thing that can carry on. A week later, you can say to that student, hey, the other day when you said this, well, I went back and I looked it up and this is what it means. Or maybe you use it as an educational opportunity. Go tell me what the history of that word is. Depends on where you're at and where your students are at. And finally, we get into this echoing, and honest to goodness, this one we should have all learned. We should have all just known it from the beginning. We do a lot of teaching about the Holocaust here, and when you examine the awful and challenging period of the human history of the Holocaust, we discuss three really important groups in that conflict: the perpetrators, the victims, and the biggest group of all, which included the whole world, the bystanders. Now, there's nothing at all that makes a person one thing or all another thing. Perpetrators can become victims, bystanders can become perpetrators, etc. Even the most stubborn of us have to admit that most of the time we are bystanders. We choose to be bystanders. The echo idea is just a way for us to step away from being a bystander as often as possible. And we know how this works. All too often, somebody says something objectionable, and then some other person says, oh no, I don't agree. That other person might be you. And then, of course, as they say in Hamlet, the rest is silence. Nobody else says a word. But what this strategy says is say a word. Say it. Yes, I agree with you. That you're right. That is a bad thing to say. You shouldn't say that anymore. That's echoing. It's really, really easy. But it is, it simply means you join in and you become a partner with the person who spoke against hate. And as we practice this, others around us can learn that system too, especially in your classroom. Yeah, Yvonne.
It just reminds me of a book I used to read to kids called Say Something. And it really focused on the bystander not having to go and this was about bullying, confront the bully. But when they saw that somebody was being bullied, they went up to the victim and just said, hey, do you want to come play with me? Do you want to sit with me at lunch? That was wrong what he said to you. I don't think that about you. And that the action that this is, in this case, it was students, but the young children, the action that they can take doesn't have to be putting themselves in harm's way and standing up to the bully. It's almost just as effective to support the person who was being bullied. And there was some study that sort of showed that can really be very impactful and can be a way of taking action that maybe is more accessible to people, especially when they're first sort of starting out to go past just not saying anything.
Exactly. And we know how risky it is to speak up. So when somebody takes that risk for a positive reason, they're the ones who want to get the support and the thanks. It sure seems to me common sense. And so I use this all the time. I'm probably irritating to the people around me for it, but it really helps. And it does make the person who said something, the perpetrator, at very least stop and think for a moment. And that's ultimately what we're going to do, what we need to do. We know that we're not equipped. We don't have the tools to address all of the challenges, but we certainly have the tools to treat everyone as an individual whose thoughts are worth hearing. And that's all this is asking us to do. So, what will you say, and what will you encourage others to do? As you can see, there really isn't a right approach. All four of these work. It's just a matter of what you choose. So again, if you haven't written them down yet, write them down. Write all four of them down, and let's go back here. So interrupt, question, educate, echo, and make sure you have them. Because guess what we're going to do? We're going to practice a little bit. Luckily, our friends at Teaching Tolerance have made great resources, especially for teachers. And so I'm going to stop my share here, and we will share the first one. So these, hold on a second. There we go. So these are all on YouTube, and we'll simply look at them one by one and then sort of have a conversation. So and you can see this one is 16 seconds long. So these are not big pieces. And we can watch them twice if you need to, but let's take a look at this first one.
I didn't know what to say. A parent was upset because my classroom is inclusive. He said, why does my son have to do group work with a retarded boy? Why aren't they in their own classroom? I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to say. A parent was upset because my classroom is inclusive. He said, why does my son have to do group work with a retarded boy? Why aren't they in their own classroom? I didn't know what to say.
What strategy might you use? Oh, somebody's got a chat here. Oh, that's okay. What would you use? Go ahead.
So this is in response to the parent that's upset because of their student, because of their child.
So this is probably, yeah, you're probably at a parent teacher conference or a, you know.
I mean, there's so much you could say. You could say, well, we don't use that term, and this is why. You know, you could go into education mode. You could question, you know, I don't know, like, why do you feel that way? Or, you know, do you feel that your students' work is impacted by, I don't know. But I think the education part, just starting with clearly this parent feels like the other student is lesser than their own child, and that's very problematic, and also doesn't understand like the inclusive, I mean, I forget what the exact law is, but that, you know, all children have the right to an education and as inclusive as possible. So there's so much I would want to pressure on stuff, I guess.
And that's the point here. There's no right way to do it, but there is the way you do it. And that's what you have. So yeah, you could easily take the educational approach, and you know why we don't use that word here. But there's a little more to it. And of course it's with a parent, so it's challenging. Any other thoughts? It's a hard one, isn't it?
Mandy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, you could question, it could be coming from a place where the parent feels like their student isn't getting what they need. And so you can ask, like, what is it that you feel like is lacking? Or is there some underlying issue here? Do you feel like your student isn't getting access to resources or isn't being challenged? Or what is kind of where does this question come from? Like maybe there's something around that.
Right. It might not have anything to do with the R word. Yeah, it's a great point. Any other thoughts?
I think mine would sort of be two-pronged. Like, I think personally there would be a sense of interrupt and be like, that word is not like that offends me, and like a little bit of why. And then on the educate, I think like what we've been saying, like, you know, inclusive classrooms are strong classrooms. And then also just like how, like, if you're the strongest person in a group, you still have so much more growth in that, like a well organized group project. Like there's so much built-in differentiation that like this is only helping your student and helping every other student, right? So like education and like just like, no, that's not acceptable, right? That language.
Great, thank you. That's terrific. Anybody else? All right, let's go on to the next one.
I didn't know what to say. A lesbian student came to me upset. A classmate had told her that homosexuality was a sin and that she was going to go to hell unless she chooses a different lifestyle. I didn't know what to say.
I didn't know what to say.
Oh, sorry.
I was like,
Well, you're not going to say it. So the one about the previous one, let me go back to it.
I didn't know what to say. A lesbian student came to me upset. A classmate had told her that homosexuality was a sin and that she was going to go to hell unless she chooses a different lifestyle. I didn't know what to say.
Oh, he's going to want to do it here.
I didn't know what to say.
All right. So yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
From what she was saying, it doesn't seem like she was a part of the initial conversation between the students. So interrupting wouldn't be a possibility. What I would personally do is echo and say to that student exactly what Yvonne was saying before and what you were saying before, that telling the victim that that was not okay and that's not what I believe of you, and kind of supporting the victim of that, as well as possibly then following up with the other student who said that and questioning them on why they said that and what purpose they had for calling out the other student.
Sure. Any other comments or thoughts about that one? Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
I think that's another one that where education, even if it's indirect, if you know the other student, the student who said that, it might be a negotiation with the victim of like, do you want to confront them? Do you want to have a conversation with them? Or it could be, if you're going to have them in class, you can kind of sneaky, bring in the law and just be like, by the way, you can believe whatever you want, but here in school, there's public laws that say, what you can and can't, sort of push on other people. So there might be multiple ways of supporting the victim, especially if the victim didn't want like a direct confrontation or to get the teacher involved and deal with all of the fallout that can happen from that.
And I think that's a really important issue is to say to the student, what do you want to have happen? Because it's not your responsibility, or it could be offensive to the student if you went and involved the student that she, then she's a snitch or whatever. And so it may be that conversation of well, I'm sorry that happened, which is kind of an interrupt. But then, well, what do you want to have happen? How can I help you? I obviously disagree with that individual, but we know that people have different points of view. But then you're right. There is a law, a rule in the school district, and you may, under your policies, you may be required to report that situation that happened. But nevertheless, you could do that without identifying the individual who first entrusted you with the information. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that could fall under hate speech, maybe very clearly, or I'm not sure if hate speech is more just toward racial, but I think it's also toward, telling someone that they're going to hell because of their sexuality, that's, but I would definitely back up, or, to kind of piggyback on what Caitlin was saying about supporting the student, checking in with them, and, also maybe just letting them know, well, I don't know. I think sometimes I tend to go toward humor a little bit, where I would say something like, well, is so-and-so, God? Is so-and-so, do you really think so-and-so knows anything about what happens after you die? Does anyone really know anything? And, so-and-so doesn't really have that authority. And also just kind of that, saying something along the lines of, people tend to, fear is kind of the base of fear and ignorance, kind of like, I don't really know the other person's motivation, but in a lot of cases it is fear and ignorance, and kind of just, it's really not about you. Whatever they said, it really, honest to God, has almost nothing to do with you. It's just their own past experience, their own stuff. And, you almost just have to feel bad, but what do you need? And also, kind of reinforcing like that fear and ignorance, like we don't control other people. But you know, I don't know if that's really super appropriate, but I think that's kind of where my mind goes, because you know, to just like almost separate it like from the personal, because it really doesn't almost have to really do with you. Like, yes, it hurts, and yes, it's horrible that happened, and I want to support you, but just so you know, this really almost isn't about you per se, you know?
Yeah, and that, but the only thing you said there that I just lend some caution to is in talking about the other person and quantifying the other person as you know, being ignorant or being, you know,
Or just say, well,
because you never know what's gonna come back and how
right. It's just that I guess in a lot of times with things like hate speech, or when people say those kinds of things, you know, maybe even just asking, well, maybe, I don't know if it's that effective to ask, like, why do you think they said that? I mean, yeah,
Right.
the fear part, like not understanding, not knowing something.
Right, and it depends, of course, on how well you know the student who's
Right.
talking to you and how well you know the student who's been the perpetrator of this. And it's very challenging. And so you know your students, and that's really what's the most important thing. So you are responding authentically. That's the other piece of this. Because if you consistently respond authentically, they will believe you and they will trust you. And when the parents come, you can say, here's why I said that. Here's what it is, and you're still being your authentic self. It might be challenging, but that's how it goes. Speaking about challenging, here's one that gives a different twist to things.
I didn't know what to say. Last week at a staff meeting, the principal told us some students from a nearby trailer park would be attending a different school next year. Some teachers cheered. I didn't know what to say. Last week at a staff meeting, the principal told us some students from a nearby trailer park would be attending a different school next year. Some teachers cheered. I didn't know what to say.
So a bit of a challenge there. Here you are with you, the leader of your school, with all the staff in a staff meeting, and you know the different tensions that exist in a staff meeting anyway. What can you do? How would you respond? This is probably several layers of it. Any thoughts, any questions? Go ahead and unmute yourself if I can't see you.
Would it be too passive to sort of state something positive or wonderful about those students that you would miss as a response?
I don't think it would be too passive. It's a pretty bold choice in a staff meeting with the people who just applauded. But I think you're right, Jessica. It's to speak up and to not say you're wrong for applauding and you're wrong, principal, for speaking this. But there were some great kids in that group of students. And hopefully there's somebody standing next to you saying, yeah, I agree, there were some good kids in that. But yeah, that's an immediate response you can use. But this might be one of those situations where you really have to gauge your level of comfort. How much are you really able to say? Yeah, go ahead.
This is also not super strong, but just saying something very simple like ouch, and you don't have to, it could be taken as sarcasm or agreement but it just might sort of stop it from continuing. And then depending on your relationship with the people who were cheering, you know, even if you had just a connection of some kind with even one of them, to maybe talk to them about it later and just say, I felt really uncomfortable. And also, I mean, I'm going to be truthful that I have definitely had the experience of seeing a difficult kid, that used to take tons of my time, finding out that their family was moving and being like, oh, okay, that's going to help me this year. So I don't want to say that I haven't like silently cheered when I've heard about, a difficult kid not being something that I was going to have to directly deal with. But I do think, finding some way, ideally within a relationship, to challenge it a little bit or a lot.
Yeah, I think that certainly the feeling it is one that we all have experience with. But the question of how the appropriateness of the principal saying that in a staff meeting, knowing that they were going to get that, leading that response, or whistleblowing that response, or whatever, what they call dog whistling that response. And so, there might also be a time down the road for you to have a private conversation with the principal, who probably feels the same way. Those kids were, a lot of those kids were challenged. So yeah, it's a tricky piece. So we're running right up against our time here, and I wanted to share one more quick video. And also, Robin, if you can put the evaluation in the chat, that would be terrific. I know there'll be an evaluation process, I'm sure, for the conference itself, but we'd love your feedback. And certainly, if you're looking for help on any of these issues, all of our programs at the Holocaust and Human Rights Center are free, and they're all being provided virtually now. So we can go to your island without even swimming. So we're happy to do that. And so I wanted to end just with some inspiration, and an inspiration for teachers. Clint Smith is a poet and an author, and was a teacher, a researcher. He lives in Washington, D.C. And a few years ago, he was asked to share his views on this topic of speaking up and finding your voice. And he shared a really personal story. So here's Clint Smith. We'll end with him.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a 1968 speech where he reflects upon the civil rights movement, states, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." As a teacher, I've internalized this message. Every day all around us, we see the consequences of silence manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, violence, genocide, and war. In the classroom, I challenge my students to explore the silences in their own lives through poetry. We work together to fill those spaces, to recognize them, to name them, to understand that they don't have to be sources of shame. In an effort to create a culture within my classroom where students feel safe sharing the intimacies of their own silences, I have 4 core principles posted on the board that sits in the front of my class, which every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, tell your truth. I find myself thinking a lot about that last point, tell your truth. And I realized that if I was going to ask my students to speak up, I was going to have to tell my truth and be honest with them about the times where I failed to do so. So I tell them that growing up as a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up, sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand his sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I had spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own. So sometimes I just wouldn't say anything, appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, really searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flawed, gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chain. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau. And just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you ever needed is your voice? Thank you.
Well, there, hopefully that sends you off to the next programs with some joy and some hope. Again, thank you so much for hanging in there and paying attention. I'm putting my email in the chat. If you need anything, feel free to reach out. And I will say that I do have a Word document with questions for students, just like those videos that we saw that I sort of coddled together, that I'm happy to share if you decide that this is something you'd like to do with your students. I'd be happy to help you do that. So just shoot me an email and we can help you work out. Thank you so much for your time.